There is a moment in music when the entire room stops breathing. Not because something went wrong, but because something so unexpected and so beautiful happened that the audience no longer knew how to react. That kind of moment does not happen often. Most people who attend classical music concerts go through their whole lives without experiencing it even once. But on one unforgettable evening in the Russian city of Naberezhnye Chelny, every single person in that concert hall experienced exactly that. And the one who caused it was a boy who was not even tall enough to reach the piano pedals. His name was Alexei Mysin. He was born on October 28, 2010 in the city of Stavropol in southern Russia. By all appearances, he looked like any other small child. The kind you might see chasing a ball in a park or reaching for something on a shelf that was just a little too high. He had a round, cheerful face and the kind of natural energy that young children carry everywhere they go. But inside that small frame was something that most people spend an entire lifetime searching for and never find. Alexei had music living inside him in a way that could not be explained by practice alone. It was something deeper, something that seemed to have been placed in him before he even came into the world. His family would later say that the story of his connection to music began before he was even born. His older sister played the piano regularly at home, and while their mother was still pregnant with Alexei, something remarkable happened. Every time his sister sat down at the keyboard and began to play, the unborn baby would move and react inside the womb. His parents noticed it clearly. The music reached him before the world did. It was as if from the very beginning, even before his first breath, Alexei and music already knew each other. When he was old enough to walk and explore the house, he was drawn to the piano in a way that children are normally drawn to toys or food. He did not treat it as a piece of furniture or a mysterious object to be avoided. He approached it naturally, as if it already belonged to him. By the time he was 3.5 years old, he had started playing. Not banging, not experimenting randomly the way most toddlers do, but actually playing with intention and feeling. His first teacher, Lyudmila Tichomirova, recognized quickly that what she was dealing with was not a talented child in the ordinary sense. This was something far rarer. His parents were not professional musicians. They were ordinary people who loved their family and wanted their children to be happy. When they saw what Alexei could do, they did not try to push him or turn him into a performing machine. They followed his lead. He was the one who wanted to be at the piano. He was the one who would sit for long stretches of time working through pieces that children his age could not even begin to understand. The music was not a burden to him. It was play, but play of a kind that produced results that made trained adults pause and take notice. By the time he was 5 years old, Alexei had already taken his talent to a competitive stage. He participated in an international competition for young pianists called Astana Piano Passion, where he performed against children up to the age of 11. He was the youngest competitor and he walked away as a laureate. Around the same time, he appeared on a well-known Russian television competition called Bluebird, where he performed alongside Denis Matsuv, one of the most celebrated pianists in Russia. Matsuv was a towering figure in the classical music world, a man whose name alone commanded respect in concert halls across Europe. Standing beside this giant of the piano, the tiny 5-year-old played with a poise and confidence that left the television audience speechless. The image of a small boy sitting next to a master, matching his energy and holding his own, was one that people talked about for months afterward. After that television appearance, the interest in Alexei grew quickly. He was accepted into the Central Music School at the Moscow State Conservatory, one of the most prestigious music institutions in all of Russia. This was the school where future concert pianists were shaped and trained. The students who walked its hallways had dedicated their entire young lives to music. To be accepted there at such a young age was an honor that even older, more experienced musicians dreamed about. Alexei arrived there not as a curiosity or a novelty, but as a serious student under the guidance of Professor Natalia Troll. The years of training that followed were intense and deliberate. Alexei was not simply learning songs. He was being shaped into a complete musician, someone who understood phrasing, dynamics, tone, and the emotional language of every piece he touched. The repertoire he studied was not designed for children. He was being handed the works of Mozart, Chopin, Schumann, and other composers whose music demands not only technical skill, but a kind of emotional intelligence that most people do not develop until well into adulthood. Somehow, Alexei carried all of it naturally. By the time he was 8 years old, word had reached concert organizers in Naberezhnye Chelny, a city in the Tatarstan region of Russia, that this young boy from Moscow was unlike anything they had seen. They made arrangements for him to perform there as a soloist, not with a simple student piece, but with a full symphony orchestra behind him. The piece they selected was Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 3 in D major. It was a demanding work even for professional pianists, filled with rapid passages, delicate trills, and moments that required the performer to lead the orchestra with authority and presence. The night was set, the orchestra was ready, and the concert hall was filled with an audience that had come with very high expectations. What they were about to witness would go far beyond anything they had imagined. The evening of the concert arrived with the kind of quiet anticipation that fills a hall before something important begins. The audience had settled into their seats, programs in hand, some of them already whispering among themselves about the unusual nature of the night. A symphony orchestra was present, fully assembled on the stage, with all the weight and presence that a professional ensemble carries. The musicians had tuned their instruments, the conductor had reviewed the score, and the stage was lit with the warm glow that classical venues are known for. But the person everyone was waiting for had not yet appeared. When he finally walked out onto that stage, a ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Some people leaned forward, others exchanged quiet glances. The soloist who stepped into the spotlight was a child who looked small enough to get lost in the orchestra behind him. Elise Myson walked to the piano with a calmness that did not match his age or his size. He wore a formal suit, the kind that looks serious and grown-up on an adult, but on a child draws attention to just how young he really is. His steps were steady, not rushed, not nervous. He acknowledged the audience with a brief, polite nod and then turned to the piano and sat down. His feet did not reach the pedals. A small wooden extension had been fitted to the instrument so that he could press them during the performance. That small detail said everything. This was not a standard situation. The hall was quiet now, completely still, and the conductor raised his baton. The orchestra began the opening of Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 3 in D major, and the music filled the room with the kind of elegance that Mozart always carries. The introduction built steadily, preparing the ground for the soloist to enter. And then it was Elise's turn. His hands came down on the keys and the piano voice entered the music, and in that single moment, something shifted in the hall. The sound was not what people had been bracing themselves for. There was no hesitation, no childlike stumbling, no sense that a small person was doing their best to handle big music. The notes came out clean, shaped, and full of intention. It was as if the piano had been waiting for exactly this kind of touch. What made the performance remarkable was not just the accuracy of the notes. Any highly trained child can hit the right keys at the right time with enough practice. What Elise brought to the stage went beyond mechanics. He played with feeling, with genuine musical expression that reached out into the audience and pulled people in. The phrasing moved naturally, the way breathing moves, rising and falling with a sense of purpose that belongs to musicians who have spent decades understanding a piece. He communicated with the orchestra behind him not through words or even visible signals, but through the music itself. The orchestra responded to him the way a skilled ensemble responds to a real soloist, adjusting, listening, following his lead through the delicate passages and the more energetic ones alike. The audience sat in silence, but it was not the polite and patient silence of people waiting for a performance to end. It was the silence of people who had been captured. Eyes that had arrived with mild curiosity were now fixed on the stage without blinking. Parents who had brought their own children to the concert found themselves leaning forward without realizing it. Older audience members who had attended hundreds of classical performances over the years had a different expression on their faces, one that combined surprise with something close to emotion. They were recognizing something, but they were also struggling to process it, because everything their experience told them said that what they were seeing should not be possible. The concerto moved through its first movement with clarity and confidence. Elise navigated the faster runs with a lightness that prevented them from sounding mechanical. In the quieter passages, he brought the volume down with control, not letting the notes drop carelessly but guiding each one to its proper place in the phrase. The dynamics were handled with maturity. He knew when Mozart wanted boldness and when he wanted gentleness, and he delivered both without exaggeration. He was not playing at Mozart. He was playing Mozart fully and completely, as if the music belonged to him by right. By the time the first movement came to its close, something was already happening in the seats of that concert hall that is not part of the normal routine of a classical performance. People were stirring, not out of restlessness, but out of a kind of overwhelmed energy that had nowhere to go. Some audience members looked at the people next to them with wide eyes as if to ask whether they were seeing and hearing the same thing. The judges and invited guests who were seated in prominent positions had gone very quiet in a different way than the rest of the crowd. Their professional training told them to listen critically, to assess, to maintain composure. But professional training is only so powerful when what you are hearing breaks the frame of what you expected. The second movement arrived, and this is where many in the audience quietly lost the battle they had been fighting against their own emotions. This movement of the concerto is slower and more introspective, the kind of music that asks the performer to be still on the inside while the hands continue working. It is music that exposes a performer instantly. There is nowhere to hide in a slow movement. Every note is held up to the light. Elise played it with an interior calm that was almost unsettling to watch. A boy of 8 years old was sitting at a concert grand piano in front of hundreds of people, leading a full orchestra, and playing one of the most emotionally demanding passages in the concerto as if he had been living inside that music his whole life, which in a way he had. The third movement of the concerto arrived like a breath of energy after the stillness of the second. It moved faster, brighter, with a playfulness that Mozart favored in his final movements. The music asked for lightness and speed, but also for a kind of joy, the sort that is not performed but felt. Elise brought all of it. His fingers moved across the keys with a fluency that the audience could see as clearly as they could hear it. There was no effort visible on his face, no gritting of teeth, no concentration so tight that it looked like strain. He played with what could only be described as ease, the kind that only comes when a person is completely at home in what they are doing. The orchestra matched him, and together they carried the concerto toward its closing section. As the final notes of the piece came together and the last chord rang through the hall, there was a pause, the natural silence that falls between the end of music and the beginning of a response. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but it felt longer because it was filled with something. The entire audience had been holding something inside them throughout the performance, a collected breath, a held response, and in that brief pause it all released at once. The applause that came was not the measured, appreciative clapping of a polite audience. It was sudden and loud and full of genuine feeling. People rose from their seats, first in ones and twos, then in rows, and then all at once. The standing ovation was not organized or coordinated. It was spontaneous, the kind that happens when a crowd reacts before it thinks. Some people were clapping with their hands above their heads. Others were calling out, not in a disruptive way, but with the natural sound of people who have been moved and cannot stay quiet. There were audience members with tears on their faces, and they were not embarrassed about it because everyone around them understood completely. The judges sat in their assigned section of the hall, and one by one they rose as well. These were trained, experienced professionals whose entire working lives had been spent evaluating musical performance. They had heard hundreds of concerts, sat through competitions, listened to gifted young musicians from across the country and beyond. They had developed the kind of measured perspective that years of deep listening creates. And every single one of them was on their feet. Some of them were not just clapping but shaking their heads slowly, the way a person does when they are confronted with something they cannot fully explain. One judge was seen pressing a hand to their chest, a quiet and private gesture that said more than any score on an evaluation form ever could. Elise sat at the piano for a moment after the music ended, his hands resting gently in his lap. Then he stood, turned to the orchestra behind him, and gave a small, respectful bow to acknowledge the musicians who had shared the stage with him. He turned to the audience and bowed again, a simple and unhurried gesture, not dramatic or theatrical but genuine. He looked like what he was, a child who had just done something he loved and was grateful for the chance to do it. The crowd responded with another wave of applause, louder if anything than the first. Backstage, the atmosphere was charged. The orchestra musicians who had played alongside him were talking among themselves with animated faces. Several of them sought out the small boy to say something directly to him, shaking his hand with a warmth that musicians reserve for those they truly respect. The conductor, who was a seasoned professional with years of experience leading orchestras through every kind of performance, spoke about Elise in terms that surprised even the people who had expected the concert to go well. He said that performing with the boy had not felt like guiding a young student. It had felt like playing with a real musician, one who listened, responded, and gave back to the ensemble with full presence. Word began to move through the city that night. People who had been in the audience called family members and friends before they had even reached their cars. The story was too large to hold inside. An 8-year-old boy had stood in front of a symphony orchestra in a formal concert hall and played Mozart at a level that brought every judge in the room to their feet. It was the kind of story that people feel the need to share immediately, not because it was shocking in a negative way, but because it was one of those rare pieces of news that restores something in the listener. A sense that extraordinary things are still possible, that human potential still has rooms in it that most of us have never opened. In the days and weeks that followed the concert, recordings of the performance began to circulate. Someone had captured the evening on video, and once those clips reached the internet, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Viewers from Russia, Europe, Asia, and beyond watched the footage and responded with the same disbelief and emotion that the live audience had experienced in the hall. Comment sections filled rapidly with messages in dozens of languages. The words were different, but the feelings were the same. People wrote that they had watched the video multiple times. They wrote that they had cried without expecting to. They wrote that they had called their children into the room to watch alongside them. They wrote that the clip had appeared in their feeds by chance and had stopped their day completely. Classical music audiences and professional musicians reacted with particular intensity. This community is not easily impressed. People who have devoted their lives to the highest standards of musical performance tend to be careful with their praise, understanding as they do just how much work and talent a great performance requires. But within this community, the response to Elyse's performance was unanimous. Forum discussions, social media posts, and written commentary from musicians and educators all pointed to the same conclusion. What this child had done was not a precocious imitation of adult musicianship. It was the real thing. Music teachers in particular found the video deeply affecting. Many of them had spent decades trying to help students find the emotional truth inside a piece of music, trying to explain in words what lives beyond words, the invisible quality that separates technically correct playing from genuinely meaningful playing. They showed the video to their students as an example not of what to copy, but of what to aspire toward. The boy at the piano was not doing anything that could be reduced to a technique or a formula. He was simply being present inside the music in a way that cannot be taught directly, but can be recognized the moment it appears. At school, Elysee continued his intensive training at the Central Music School in Moscow. His teacher, Professor Natalia Troll, had been working with him through the steady, disciplined process that serious musical education requires. She spoke about him in measured but clearly proud terms. She was careful to describe his development honestly, acknowledging both the natural gifts he had been born with and the consistent work he had put in over years of study. She understood, as all great teachers do, that natural talent and dedicated practice are not opposites but partners, and that without the one supporting the other, neither reaches its full height. The attention that Elysee received after the concert and the spread of the video brought both opportunities and responsibilities. His family remained careful and protective of him. They were aware of the particular pressure that public attention places on a child, and they made deliberate choices about how to manage his exposure. He continued to perform in selected concerts and competitions, but his education remained the center of his life, not the appearances or the recognition. His parents understood that the foundation they were building now would determine the kind of musician he became later, and they guarded that foundation with quiet seriousness. Elysee won several additional competitions in the years following the Naberezhnye Chelny concert. Each one added another layer of confirmation to what had already been apparent, that he was not a one-performance wonder or a child whose gifts would fade as he grew older. He was developing in a real and continuous way, expanding his repertoire, deepening his understanding of the music he played, and growing into himself as a performer with a distinct musical voice. The qualities that had stunned the judges at age 8 were not disappearing as he aged. They were becoming richer and more defined. The story of that concert night took on a life of its own in Russia and eventually in the broader world of classical music. It became one of those reference points that people in the music world use when they want to talk about what genuine child prodigy talent looks like. Not the kind that is manufactured through relentless drilling and parental pressure, but the kind that arises from a real and deep connection between a person and their art. Elysee's name became known not as a novelty or a curiosity, but as a name to watch. A musician whose journey was only beginning and whose best work was still ahead. What the story of Elysee Meissen leaves behind is not simply a remarkable performance by a gifted child. It leaves behind a set of questions and reflections that reach far beyond the concert hall in Naberezhnye Chelny and far beyond the world of classical piano. It invites every person who encounters it to think about what talent really is, where it comes from, and what it means when it appears in someone so young and in such an undeniable form. There is a tendency in the modern world to explain extraordinary ability by pointing to environment and training alone. And it is absolutely true that environment matters enormously. A child without access to a piano, without a teacher, without the support of a family that encourages rather than dismisses their gifts, would never have the opportunity to develop in the way that Elysee did. The structures around him shaped and supported what was inside him. That is not a small thing, and it should not be overlooked. The hours of practice, the instruction from skilled teachers, the experience of performing in front of audiences from a young age, all of it contributed to what appeared on that stage. But the reaction of every person in that concert hall, and every person who later watched the recording from thousands of miles away, pointed to something that environment and training alone cannot fully account for. There was a quality in that performance that the audience recognized as something beyond the sum of its parts. They felt it in the way that people feel music when it is truly alive, not just in the ears but somewhere closer to the center of who they are. That quality does not appear in every trained musician, no matter how many hours they have worked. It is something that some people seem to carry from the very beginning, a depth of feeling and a natural alignment with musical expression that makes their playing speak directly to listeners in a way that bypasses the analytical mind. Elise's story also says something important about childhood and the space that children need to become who they truly are. He was not pushed into music by ambitious parents who wanted to claim a prodigy. He was drawn to it by his own internal pull, from before he was even born according to those who knew him. His family followed him rather than leading him, and that choice made all the difference. When children are given the freedom to pursue what genuinely calls to them, rather than what adults decide they should be good at, the results can be extraordinary. Not every child has a gift at the level of Elise Myson, but every child has something that is uniquely and truly theirs, and the task of the adults around them is to recognize that thing and give it room to grow. The judges who rose from their seats that night in Naberezhnye Chelny were not simply responding to a technically impressive performance. They were responding to something that reminded them of why they had dedicated their own lives to music in the first place. Somewhere beneath all the years of professional evaluation and careful assessment, they were still people who had once been young and had first heard a piece of music that opened something in them. Elise's playing reached that place in them, the place that expertise covers over but never fully extinguishes. He reminded them, and everyone else in that hall, that music at its highest level is not an intellectual exercise but a human one. The small boy who walked onto that stage in a formal suit with his feet, not yet long enough to reach the pedals on their own, carried something into that room that nobody had asked him to carry, and nobody could have instructed him to carry. He carried the living reality of a gift given full expression, unburdened by self-consciousness, unspoiled by cynicism, and completely at home in the music it had loved since before the world knew its name. The audience that rose to its feet was not applauding a performance. They were acknowledging something true, and in a world that sometimes makes truth hard to find, that is a rare and precious gift.
Like, share, and subscribe, don't miss it.